It was over in less than half an hour. Firemen inspecting the burned floors the next day found dozens of bodies, charred, headless trunks, some still bent over the sewing machines. Among the remains, the inspectors found 11 engagement rings. In all, 146 people, teenagers for the most part, immigrant girls, some as young as 14, had died in the greatest industrial disaster in the city's history.
Some died of smoke inhalation, piled against the doors trying to get out. Some were burned to death, and some jumped out of the windows and died. 141 young women died. And of course, when the firemen finally enter that building, the dead bodies are heaped up against the doors because there were no fire exits, there was no safety precautions.
March 26, 1911. The remains of the dead. It is hardly possible to call them bodies, because that word would suggest something human. And there was nothing human about most of these. Were taken in a steady stream to the morgue for identification. The New York Times.
At a temporary morgue set up on a pier along the East River, relatives lined up to identify the corpses. The ghastly process took 3 full days. Seven bodies were so badly burned, they could not be identified. And on April 5th, 1911, a mass funeral was held for the unknown victims. 120,000 working people joined in the procession, despite a heavy rain, while 400,000 more watched silently from the sidewalk.
A mass emotion of sorrow and despair was felt everywhere that day. But in the weeks that followed, these emotions gave way to angry questioning and a determination that a similar tragedy must never take place in New York again.
A few months later, the owners of the Triangle Factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were tried for manslaughter, having locked their workers in. But to the shocked disbelief of the victims' families, and of most New Yorkers, the 2 men were acquitted when the prosecution was unable to prove that they had actually known that the exit door was locked at the exact time of the fire.
There was a trial, and the trial found that the owners were not guilty, for they had broken no law. Yes, they might not have been very nice to have locked in these young women, but there was no law, and so there was no repercussion.
Within weeks, the Triangle Factory had reopened in a nearby building. Visiting the new plant, fire inspectors found the exit door blocked by rows of sewing machines. But now, something extraordinary began to occur. From the ashes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire would begin to arise one of the most dramatic and far-reaching political transformations in American history.
It was a kind of a moment that the city could no longer ignore the reality that had been with the city for decades of what a sweatshop was. The whole city felt involved in those bodies that were thudding to the pavement. I mean, you couldn't say they don't relate to us. The impact of this one fire, the horror of the bodies, the number of the dead, had an impact that transformed. It was a turning point in the fight for social welfare legislation in New York.
the Triangle Fire catastrophe. It's an epic event in the dynamics of the city's politics and economy and everything else. In the immediate aftermath, what happens is a mass meeting of concerned citizens. A lot of officials in business put together an operation and go up to the state legislature and say, you've got to do something about this. We need reform legislation to police the workplace and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
The key to change lay with the New York State legislature. The key to the legislature, however, lay in the pocket of Silent Charlie Murphy, the inscrutable, taciturn boss of Tammany Hall, and the last man in New York from whom reformers could expect any help. But the reformers were wrong.
Silent Charlie was an extremely shrewd politician, and he understood that the demographics of the city were changing, that you couldn't simply win by appealing to the Irish vote, that you had to make some attempt to draw in Jews, Italians, other new immigrants, that you had to worry about competing politicians, particularly Socialist Party, and also progressive Republicans, that you had all these people now in settlement houses and progressive reformers who were also a part of the political scene. And I think that what Murphy understood was that somehow Tammany had to adapt to the new realities of the city, the new political realities.
To the amazement of the reformers, whose efforts had been stymied by Tammany at every turn, Murphy supported the call for an investigation, then placed two of his closest protégés on it. Robert F. Wagner Sr., the leader of the state Senate, and 38-year-old Al Smith, now head of the state assembly. The grueling 4-year-long factory investigation that ensued would make Smith's career and change forever life in New York. Week after week, month after month, the Factory Commission ground on, taking testimony from fire inspectors, sanitation experts, health officials, and labor leaders. Calling in its first year alone more than 200 witnesses, then launching an unprecedented statewide tour of factories, beginning with New York.
This Factory Commission started to tour the state. And the reformers couldn't help noticing that no matter how hard the trip was, everyone would miss one trip or another. Al Smith never missed a trip. They couldn't help noticing his face when they would go to these factories and they'd see these rooms without a window in which mothers with their children worked 7 days a week. They remembered going to one factory where the owner assured him he had no children working, and then someone pointed them to an elevator, and he had put all the children in an elevator and put it between floors so nobody would see them. Then it came time for the Factory Commission to write its laws. And Smith sat at the table. He was very conscious of his lack of education. And he said, you make the recommendations, I'll fight for them. And it was a very wonderful and dramatic thing. The reformers had gone up to Albany for years and had never gotten these proposals for child labor laws, for women's labor laws, for wages and hours laws, for factory compensation, for disability compensation passed. Now they sat up there in the galleries of the assembly, and down there on the floor was this man they despised, fighting for them and getting these things through. And for the years to come after that, Al Smith was the weapon of reform in New York. He was the red-faced, loud-voiced, paunchy Tammany henchman who got through the dreams of social welfare reforms for which reformers had been dreaming now ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
The resulting flood of legislation, one man later said, was nothing less than epoch-making. Landmark laws affecting not only fire protection, but every aspect of factory life. Plant owners would now be required to provide enclosed staircases, fire sprinklers, and adequate lighting, ventilation, and washrooms. Dangerous machinery would be regulated by law. Women would not be allowed to work more than 54 hours a week. Children under 14 would not be allowed to work in factories at all.
And the logjam is broken. And what you get in 1913 is a flood of progressive legislation. At the heartland of it all is indeed safety regulations. But there's a tremendous raft of new laws, and Wagner and Smith are at the heartland of this. They introduce something like 60 bills, of which 56 get passed. And the political center of gravity of the city and the state, as a consequence, is profoundly shifted.
Business interests were outraged. To own a factory in New York is now a calamity, the leaders of the real estate board declared. But nothing could stop the momentum of the campaign Al Smith was now leading, with almost evangelical fervor, to use the power of the state to change people's lives.
Well, in other words, politics is not simply now about helping people out when they're in need, or giving them the coal to get through the winter, or helping them get a job when they're unemployed. It's now about using the power of the state government to really get at some of the underlying problems of city life. The point here is that machine politicians find that it's in their own interest to begin to think about politics in a less parochial way, and ultimately in a more national way. What can we do when we control the city or the state or the Congress to make people's lives better? How can we improve working conditions? How can we improve housing conditions? How can we improve educational opportunities?
As the subway had brought New Yorkers together physically, so the grief and horror of the Triangle Fire brought them together emotionally and spiritually. "We banded ourselves together," Francis Perkins later wrote, "moved by a sense of stricken guilt, to prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening again." In the years to come, as the leaders of the Factory Investigating Commission moved into positions of power in City Hall, in Albany, and eventually in Washington, the remarkable alliance would become an unstoppable engine for change, not only in New York, but across the nation. Looking back, Francis Perkins, appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt as the first Secretary of Labor and the first woman cabinet member in American history, would say simply, the New Deal began on March 25th, 1911, the day the Triangle Factory burned.